going to talk about a guide to creating a law school outline. So what I want to do is take you through this process step by step so you know exactly how to get started when you outline in law school. So first, figure out the overall structure of your outline by looking at your syllabus. For example, in your contracts class, you might talk about contract formation, which includes things like offer, acceptance, consideration. You might talk about defenses like illegality or insanity. You might talk about the statute of frauds. And then lastly, you might talk about remedies. So if you talk about all these 4 things, this is going to create the bird's eye view of your outline. And within each section, there's obviously going to be a lot more, but this will help you kind of organize how your outline is going to look overall. It's really helpful to consult your syllabus because oftentimes the syllabus is organized in the same way with headings and subheadings that you'll probably want to organize your outline. Next, start with the first issue. For example, offer is the first issue in our little sample outline, and state the rules that go with each issue. The best way to find the rules that go with each issue is to look closely at your class notes. Hopefully your professor has stated the rule or alluded to them. For example, sometimes they say, oh yeah, the second restatement says blah, 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 and then you know you want to use the second restatement rule. So use whatever rule your professor says in class. Sometimes professors will break things down in a different way than the restatement or a casebook might break something down. So I would recommend using whatever your professor says in class as your rule statement. If you really don't know, like let's say that your professor is really vague and you leave class still not knowing what the rules are, then you can look to your casebook or a restatement or something. You need to have some black letter law in your outline, so make sure that you're finding rules that go with each of these concepts. Next, break down the rule into manageable parts. So you want to actually take that rule and break it down into its key elements. And this is for a few reasons. First of all, it's much easier to remember a rule if you can break it down into elements. Second of all, it'll be much easier to apply the law if you have key elements that you're looking for. So for example, for contract formation, instead of writing a long sentence about what contract formation is, like an offer requires intent and specific terms, the specific terms are price, quantity, identity of the offeree, blah, 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 blah. Break it down into a way that makes sense and it's manageable and easy to learn. So you can even say intent, specific terms, and then break it down further, price, quantity, and identity of the offeree. This makes it simpler and easier to learn your outline. Next, add cases, or at least the rules from cases. Now, even if you don't read every word of every case, and I definitely didn't in law school, it can still be helpful to add the cases that you talk about in class. For example, you can see in the sample outline, there's some cases added. Fairmount Glassworks, Harvey v. Facey, Owen v. Tennyson, and this is how I would organize my outline is I'd put the case name and I'd have a very short description of what happened in the case. Usually about a sentence, okay, or just the holding from the case. And I kind of went, overboard. I'm really good at memorizing. I would always memorize the case names that went with the rules, and I would cite cases on my exam. And again, I could do this even without necessarily reading every word of every case. And it was also easier for me to do this because I was starting my outlines right away. And so I had a lot of time to memorize things like case names that go with certain rules. So you might want to consider doing that, maybe not for all the cases because that can be a lot, but for some key cases that your professor spends a long time talking about, I would include those in your outline and try to memorize those case names because those are more important cases. If your professor only spends 30 seconds or 5 minutes on a case, probably less important. Okay, so next, use hypothetical examples or important points your professor made in class to illustrate a rule. Oftentimes you can get this from the Socratic method. Your professor will be asking a question, they'll come up with a hypo, the student will answer it. You don't necessarily want to take what the student says as, the right answer, but your professor should get them to the right answer during the Socratic method, or should hopefully tell the class what the right answer is. And it's often helpful to write those down because they can serve as examples to you later. And sometimes your professor will even formulate exam questions, that seem kind of similar to the hypos that they asked in class. So you can put them right in the appropriate spot in your outline, under whichever concept your professor is talking about. And then lastly, make sure to identify and draw attention to minority rules, exceptions to the rules, and the parts of the law that are unsettled. Sometimes you will have, okay, here's the majority rule, here's the minority rule, or here's the rule and here's an exception, and here's an exception to an exception. Or here this part of the law is unsettled. States are going different ways on this. It's unclear, what's going to happen. So a lot of students feel uncomfortable because they like this certainty, but these areas of uncertainty are what is really ripe, fertile grounds for testing. Okay, so if there's something uncertain that requires you to use this more like lawyerly analysis, like, it could turn out this way if the court or if the jurisdiction follows this rule, it could turn out this way, blah, 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 if they don't. That's the type of thing that you're going to get a lot of points for on an exam, and it shows your ability to be analytical. So don't ignore if there's two separate rules that contradict each other, or if there's a majority and minority rule. Don't ignore any rule. Instead, put them both in your outline, recognize that there's an ambiguity in the law, and make sure to pay attention to that because your professor could easily test on those ambiguities or unsettled areas of the law.